This morning, I'd like to look at servant leadership. And so if you would turn with me to John chapter 13, verses 12 through 17, it says this. Jesus here is speaking, or is acting, and he says, when he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. Do you understand what I have done for you? He asked them. You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. I tell you the truth, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them. In the events that we just read about, we are at the Last Supper. So these are the last few moments that Jesus will have of his freedom before he is arrested and tried and crucified. Literally the last few hours before he is arrested and crucified. Why did Jesus choose this moment to wash the disciples' feet? Well, the reason goes back to a few days earlier and to events that immediately precede Jesus washing their feet. So, to kind of set the stage for this passage of Scripture, Lazarus has gotten very ill. Lazarus and Mary and Martha were all siblings, and they were good friends of Jesus. And Jesus is up in Galilee, and someone has sent word to Jesus saying that Lazarus is very, very ill. And Jesus purposely waits. He doesn't immediately rush down there. He purposely waits until Lazarus has passed away. And then he tells the disciples that we're going down to Jerusalem to Lazarus. Now, there was a tremendous amount of opposition for Jesus down in Jerusalem. So much so that Jesus had missed the last Passover. He didn't go back at all. And the disciples are aware of this as well. Because Thomas, you know that guy, Doubting Thomas, the guy that we always talk about and give a bad rap because he's like, unless I see the holes in his hands, I'm not believing. You have to give props to Thomas because Thomas turns to one of the other disciples and he says, if Jesus is going to Jerusalem, then let us go there and die with him. Because he recognizes the kind of opposition that Jesus is facing in Jerusalem, right? And so they, on their way down to Lazarus' home, the mother of James and John comes up to Jesus and she says, Jesus, when you enter your kingdom, can you give the two most important places in your kingdom to my two sons? And Jesus asked them, he says, are you willing to drink from the cup that I'm going to drink from? And they asked, yeah, you know. And Jesus' response was, you will, but that's not really my place to give those. So what happens is all of the rest of the disciples are upset. And they're upset not just because James and John's mother has asked for the most important positions for James and John, but they're upset because that's the position that they want, right? And so Jesus sees what's going on there, and he stops and he tries to deal with it right then and there. But just like a bunch of siblings, you know, when siblings fight and mom and dad step in, the fight didn't really go away. The argument didn't really go away. It just went underground. Right? And so that sometimes happens, you know, at homes too with our kids. You know, they're fighting and mom and dad say, I want you to settle this right now. And they're like, whatever. And it doesn't really go away. It just goes underground, right? And that's exactly what happened with the disciples. And so over the course of 3.5 years that the disciples have been with Jesus, they've kind of developed their pecking order, habit, right? When I was growing up, everybody at my house had their seat at the table. So my dad was at the head of the table. My mom was immediately to my dad's left. From there was Chrissy, and then David, and then me, and then Debbie. And I never knew until years later why the pecking order was the way it was. It just, that was our seat, right? Well, Mom said later that the way that we all ended up that way was Dad sat at the head of the table, Mom sat to his left, the baby sat next to her so she could feed it. When the next baby came along, moved around the corner, right? And so we kept getting moved around the corner as the new babies kept coming. Well, the disciples, I would argue, had their place that they sat to. In their culture, the most important person sat at the head of the table, and then on either side of them was the next most important person, all the way down to the foot of the table. And I would say over the last 3.5 years, they had developed their place where they sat at the table. And I would submit to you that normally, Peter and John were on Jesus' right and left side. Now, however that came out, I'm not sure. But on this particular occasion, as they're coming in for the Last Supper, this last time that Jesus really has to spend with the disciples, they're still fighting over who's most important. And you can imagine in a society where there's no paved roads, there's no cars, everything is dirt, you're wearing open sandals, what your feet would look like after traveling around in the dirt all day long. Just like you wash your hands before you go to eat supper or go to eat your meal, it was customary to wash your feet so you don't bring your dirty, stinky feet, into the house. But each disciple was like, I'm not washing their feet. They should be washing mine. So Jesus comes in, and as he looks at the table, here's all these guys with dirty, stinky feet, because nobody is going to wash anybody else's feet, because I should be most important. And he looks at the table, and instead of them sitting like they normally do, they're all out of order because they're fighting for who's most important, sitting at the table. Peter is out of place, and Judas, of all people, is sitting in his spot, right? And John is probably where he normally is. And I can just imagine Peter down around the foot of the table just like this, right? Sour apples and unhappy. And I picture Jesus, this time that is so important to him, and a time when he really, really needs his disciples. And he takes one look and he just goes, you ever felt like that? Like he looks at that and he says, because he realizes that what should have been dealt with days ago is still boiling, right? And so Jesus takes off his robe and he walks over to the basin and he starts washing the disciples' feet. A task that was normally relegated to a household servant if you had one. Because nobody wants to wash stinky, dirty feet. And he gets to Peter, and Peter's like, "Oh, no, Lord, you can't wash my feet." And Jesus says, "If I don't wash your feet, you can't be part of what I'm doing." And he gets to the end, and he says, "If I, who am your Lord and teacher, are willing to wash your feet, then you have to be willing to wash other people's feet as well." You see, leadership is not about being boss or bossy. It's about leading other people. Today, the term servant leadership sounds more like an oxymoron than something that we should pursue. However, this is what Jesus is calling us to do. This morning, I'd like to point out 3 characteristics of servant leadership. The first is this: a good servant leader leads by example. A good servant leader leads by example. John 3:15 says this: "I have given you an example to follow. Do as I have done for you." What is the example? Well, it's Jesus washing the disciples' feet. Here is their teacher, their rabbi, who is doing something unthinkable in that culture by washing the feet of his very own disciples. And Jesus says, "Do as I have done to you. Follow my example." I find it interesting because Paul says something very similar in 1 Corinthians 11:1. He says, "Follow my example, even as I am following the example of Christ." If you want to be a good leader, you will lead those people that are following you by example. A good leader never leads from behind. The whole idea of leadership is that you have to be out in front. What is that old saying? The scenery never changes unless you're the lead dog or something like that, right? But leadership, if you're going to be a leader, you have to lead by example. Secondly, a good servant leader does not lord over his followers. A good servant leader does not lord over his followers. You know, Jesus could have very easily said, "All right, I want one of you to wash the rest of these guys' feet." But did he do that? No, because how would that one person have felt? Wow, I am really the low of the low. Jesus must think I am the worst one here. Because else why would he ask me to wash everybody else's feet? Jesus didn't do that. Jesus instead didn't lord over them. He didn't exert his bossiness, I guess, if that's a term. But instead, he led by example. In Matthew 20:25 and 26, it says, "But Jesus called them together, and he said to them, 'You know that in this world kings are tyrants, and officials lord it over the people beneath them. But among you, it should be quite different. Whoever wants to be a leader among you must be your servant.'" That is something that is so different than the rest of the world around us, isn't it? So different. Because we have people who want to be so powerful, such big leaders that they can break the law and it doesn't matter. No, Jesus says, I want you to lead by example. I want you to serve others so that they'll want to follow you. I have an example that comes from teambuilding.com, and it's talking about Martin Luther King. It says this: "It's hard to imagine a more revered citizen of the United States than the Baptist preacher and social crusader Martin Luther King Jr. He served as a leader of the civil rights movement from 1954 until his untimely death in 1968. Martin Luther King employed a wide range of techniques in his leadership, such as influence, motivation, consideration, and stimulation. His organization of the civil rights movement was instrumental in abolishing legal segregation in the United States. As a servant leader, Martin Luther King had a tremendous impact. He was transformative, but he also tended to be autocratic. He served as a mentor and a coach. Charisma, leadership, however, was King's primary tool for winning over the American people and gaining international acclaim. Martin Luther King's visit to Mahatma Gandhi's birthplace in India inspired him to continue his non-violent crusade. During the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, on August 28, 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. would imprint on American history by delivering the iconic "I Have a Dream" speech. The enactment of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, because of King's work, permitted the federal government to desegregate public facilities. Martin Luther King got the Nobel Peace Prize in the same year. Like Gandhi before him, he showed that nonviolent demonstrations might significantly impact social transformation. The civil rights struggle was Martin Luther King's life's mission. Martin Luther King Jr. is famous for his quote, "I have a dream that my 4 children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." Martin Luther King was not the kind of person who pushed from behind and says, "You guys need to go riot." He did not promote the kind of social reform that we find with Black Lives Matters and Antifa. He was a strong advocate of nonviolent protests to change something that he saw that was wrong in society. But the reason he was so powerful as a figure in our society was because he was exactly who he claimed to be. The guy that you saw when he delivered his speeches was the same guy that lived out every single day of his life. You know, before I came here, I was working as a service manager at Penske Auto Center. And I took my training from a man named John Stanley. John Stanley was the manager of the Urbandale Penske Auto Center. And so when they moved me up into the management, that's who I trained under. And I'm here to tell you this morning that I have a tremendous amount of respect for John Stanley. He was extremely competent at his job. It was like an 8 or a 10 bay shop. And without ever looking behind him, he could tell you what vehicle was in each bay, what was being done to it, and how close it was to being finished, without ever even turning around. He was that aware of what was going on in the shop. John Stanley never asked you to do something that he was unwilling to do himself. Again, he led by example. There are times that John Stanley took a lot of heat for us as managers, because after I moved to Cedar Falls to become the manager of the Cedar Falls Penske Auto Center, he was moved up and became my district manager. And I can say with certainty that there's a lot of times that he took heat for us and stuff never ran downhill. You know what I'm talking about? One person gets in trouble and then they just blow up on the person next to them, and then that person blows up on the person next to them, right? Until the poor guy on the bottom gets everything. That never happened with John Stanley. And I'm certain that John probably could have had another promotion or two if he would have been willing to throw us under the bus. But he never did. He also had high expectations, but his expectations of us never exceeded what he expected of himself. He was an awesome boss and an excellent leader. But isn't that the same kind of characteristics that we're looking for when we want somebody to lead us as well? Nobody wants to follow somebody that has no idea what they're doing, right? We want to follow somebody that knows where they're going and knows how to get there. We want somebody who's willing to roll their sleeves up and work alongside of us. We want somebody who cares not just about the numbers, but cares about us as a person as well. And most of us are okay with high expectations as long as the person who's expecting them holds themselves to the same or even a higher standard. Right? That's good leadership. And that's the kind of leadership that people will follow even when things are sometimes hard. I can honestly tell you that there is nothing that John Stanley would have asked me to do that I would have not tried to do as long as it was not illegal or violated my conscience. Because I believed in him. That's the kind of leaders that we are called to be. And then finally, a good servant leader grows leaders like himself. A good servant leader grows leaders like himself. In Acts 14:13, it says this regarding Jesus' disciples. The Jewish leaders saw that Peter and John were not afraid to speak, and they understood that these men had no special training or education. So they were amazed. Then they realized that Peter and John had been with Jesus. And suddenly everything made sense. You know, interestingly, a lot of times you can throw leaders into two kind of categories. There are leaders that are insecure about their position or where they're at. And so many times they will gather around people around them that they deem are less qualified than they are. They don't want somebody who's going to make them look bad, so they make sure that the positions that are around them and underneath them are people who are less qualified than they are. Those people will never be very successful. They just won't. The other kind of leader is the kind of leader who finds the very best people they can to surround themselves with, knowing that not only will it help the job that they're trying to do, but it will make them better also. those are really, truly great leaders. Those people who are confident enough in their own skin and in their own position that it doesn't matter that the person that's next to them may be more qualified in some areas than they are, and they will lean on them for their expertise because he knows that it makes him better. God has given us a task to do, and that is to make and grow disciples. That's the most important thing. The most important thing is not that I receive the credit or that I receive the glory. The most important thing is that God is glorified and that people come to know him. And so, surrounding myself with the very best people that I can find to make that happen is not only what's best for the mission that God has given to me, but it's best for me too. There's a Bible verse that in the Old Testament that says, as iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another. And it's kind of this idea of these accountability groups where men or sometimes women will come together to hold each other accountable so that they will be better than they would be on their own. Jesus used this model of leadership as he tried to train the disciples. And I believe it's a good one and one that we can use too. It went like this: I do, you watch. Jesus demonstrated for the disciples what he would eventually want them to be able to do. And then the next step was, I do, you help. I'm still in charge of what's going on here, but I want you to help me make this happen. The third step was, you do, I help. And then the last step was, you do, I watch. Jesus didn't just throw them out there on their own and say, good luck with that. Hope it all works out for you. No. He showed them what he wanted. He worked with them. He gave them an opportunity to go out. And then after, they were ready, he turned it all over to them. Right? So in Luke 9, 1 through 10, and in Matthew chapter 10, the whole chapter, and then the first verse in 11, Jesus sends out the disciples. Right? He sends them out 2 by 2, and he says, don't take a robe, don't take a sword. When you go to a house, if they receive you, allow your blessing to fall on the house. If not, then, and he sends them out, and they go out and they heal people, and they do these things, and then they came back and they share with Jesus their experiences. He gives them kind of this opportunity to debrief, and that's this third step, right? You do, I help. You go out, you show me you can do this, and then come back and share it with me. Share with me your victories, the things that you accomplished. And then we get to Matthew 8:28, verses 19 and 20, where Jesus is preparing to leave. And he says what? He says, all authority is given to me in heaven and earth. Go and make disciples, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all the things that I have commanded you. And lo, I will be with you always, even to the end of the earth. Jesus says, you do, I'll watch. If it worked for him, it can work for us too. I think a lot of times we're afraid to share Jesus because we're afraid that we'll say the wrong thing. We're afraid that we'll give somebody the wrong information. right? We're afraid that we don't have all the answers. But the honest truth is, people are not going to be won by your amazing answers. They're going to be won by your sincerity. The way that Jesus has changed your life is going to be far more important to them than that you know all of the right answers or all the right Bible verses. In fact, Jesus said, it's by our love for one another that they will know that you are my disciples. I look at our world and our society, and I tell Mel, I tell her, the world's gone mad. The world's gone crazy. You see all of this crazy stuff that is happening in our world. You see hatred and vitriol. You see mass shootings. You see all of this stuff. The world is begging for answers. And you have the answer that the world is looking for. They just don't know it yet. Because it's Jesus who says, to love your enemies, to pray for those who hurt you. It's Jesus who says, treat others the way that you want to be treated. If we did it, if we loved God with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength, if we loved our neighbor as ourselves, we would have an awesome world. We would have an awesome society. The world needs what we have to offer. Don't be selfish and hold it back.